Additional aids and services are available to individuals with disabilities. To make such a request, please contact us by email by clicking the Help tab in the PD portal or at pdportal@tamu.edu, by phone including Relay Texas at 1-800-441-7323, or in writing to Train PD, PD Portal Support, 4477 TAMU, College Station, Texas 77843. Both a transcript and accessible document of the content presented in this webinar can be found as resources in the course description. Click on the blue links under Course Resources in the description. When a link is clicked, a new browser window will open.
Welcome to Workforce Wednesday, and I just wanted to share that I'm very excited today to have my colleague, Sarah Haroon Swalahi, join me to provide from cultural awareness to cultural humility, creating inclusive classrooms for our adult learners. So welcome, Sarah, and let's get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to kick us off. So welcome to today's Workforce Wednesday session entitled From Cultural Awareness to Cultural Humility, Creating Inclusive Classrooms for Our Adult Learners. As Dr. Olga mentioned, my name is Sarah Haroon Swalahi, and I am very excited to start this conversation with you all today. The objectives for this session are as follows. So by the end of this session, you should be able to reflect on your own identity as an adult. You should be able to describe the difference between cultural awareness, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility. And you should also be able to identify ways to support adult learners from different backgrounds. Now, this session relies on academic literature and also data from the Texas Teens database for 2024. Throughout the session, and for my references at the end for anyone that's interested, you'll see that many of the academic concepts related to cultural responsiveness or cultural humility actually tend to come from the healthcare sector. And while that seems a little odd at first glance, it actually makes a lot of sense. Just like teachers, doctors support a variety of patients every single day, and they need to be able to deliver medical care in social settings while also being aware of different realities of their patients. We're going to actually be turning to the healthcare industry and healthcare academics for some of their knowledge. Disclaimer that I would like to make in reference to these objectives and to our conversation today. I personally don't think that there's a quick pathway to cultural awareness, responsiveness, or humility. I think that these are deep, lifelong learning processes that start with self-reflection, but that they're necessary because it lays down the foundation for good work to follow. I say this because I don't advocate for quick tips and tricks when it comes to things like cultural humility. I think that it's actually better to go a little slow and steady. I'd actually like to start off with a reflection question for our session. So, have you ever been to the doctor because something didn't feel right or because you were in pain? And your doctor says, no, you're fine. It's all in your head. And even though you respect this doctor as an expert with knowledge and years of experience and practical work, you also know that they're wrong. What's one or two emotions that come to your mind in a situation like this?
Feeling helpless and confused.
Yeah, feeling confused. I definitely felt confused when I once got that comment. So even when we aren't the technical experts in a room, we are the experts on ourselves and on our lives. And conversations on culture are actually pretty similar to that statement. And so a central tenet that I hold is a statement that's right on the next screen. So you are the expert on your own life. I may not be the expert in the room, but I'm definitely the expert on my life. However, at the same time, I have to put some continuous effort into reflecting, learning, and unlearning activities for me to understand myself and my life. That's something that we sometimes don't always do. I'd like to share a little about myself because I recognize that even if I'm the expert on my own life, you don't actually know me. So my name is Sarah Haroon Swalahi. I'm currently a graduate research assistant at TCOL, which is the Texas Center for the Advancement of Literacy and Learning here in Texas. I serve as a member of our research and evaluation team. I'm also a full-time PhD student in the Workforce Adult and Lifelong Education program at Texas A&M. I'm very fortunate enough to bring over 12 years of global experience in education. I have designed curriculum and teacher trainings in Pakistan for middle school English language and literature. I have a master's degree in international education. I've worked for the New York City Department of Education in the Office of School Wellness Programs. Most recently, I was the global manager at a nonprofit which developed technical and vocational education programs for vulnerable adults. And I was in charge of our programs in Australia, Hong Kong, and Singapore. What's important about that is I am not a citizen or a community member of Australia, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And so during those 3 years, I thought that my technical expertise would help me get the job done. But really, it was my ability to understand the softer side of relationships, of taking the time to understand the cultures and communities within Australia, Hong Kong, and Singapore that actually made me successful in that role. And so because of that, I have a very deep commitment to education at any stage of an individual's life. While I think education is a structured process, it's driven by programs, policy, and people, which at the same time makes it something that's very incredibly personal. And so whether you're getting a degree in statistics or you're Googling how to make sourdough bread, you are actively involved in the learning process. Your brain and your personality are being changed. And I really can't think of anything that's more personal than that. And so from that lens and with my experience, the why for this session, or something that helps center me, is I am always interested in my adults, not just as learners, but also as active members of a community and society. We recognize that adults wear multiple hats with different social roles because we know that we wear multiple hats with different social roles. And so when we think about our adult learners from that perspective, the question of whether culture matters actually becomes pretty obvious. Of course, culture matters. If I'm an active member of a community and society, I'm an active member of my culture. I'd like to circle back then to the objective of this session, to learn how to approach our adult learners from the perspectives of cultural awareness, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility. From there, then, I think what's interesting and what's important to understand is culture isn't an independent process. Culture is something that we are actively involved in. And so if we want to be aware, if we want to know how to respond to our learners, and if we want to have humility within that relationship, then we are as much involved in that process as our adult learners. And so we need to not just align on what culture is, but we need to understand how our identities shape and are shaped by culture. I have another reflection question. I'd like you to take a moment to consider this question. What is culture?
Customs and traditions, formats, patterns, beliefs within a community, a way of life and upbringing, a person's experiences and beliefs within their life. Culture involves norms, customs, and beliefs that we ascribe to either from our home education or our studies.
Very interesting. I really like these responses. And I think that if we take a moment to reflect on these answers themselves, they all seem very different, but also very similar. The thing with what makes culture hard to describe and culture a little tricky is that everyone that has shared so far is correct. Culture is dimensional, and you can belong to several different cultures at a time based on your gender, your beliefs, your abilities, and interests. And that's also very true. What makes culture interesting and what makes culture divisive is that I might believe that culture is only related to a way of life, and someone else might say, no, it's only about your customs and traditions. And the thing is that culture is something that's very complex. It presents itself in a number of different ways. And we have to be open to the fact that it is not a very simple question. While this question is only 3 words, we could probably spend the next 30 to 45 minutes just discussing what is culture. So the way I like to think about culture is almost always as a metaphor. For me and for Dr. Milton Bennett, culture is an iceberg. There are seen and unseen aspects to everyone's culture. And that includes everything from our food, our clothing, our customs, our traditions, to more intangible things like those dimensional, time-based moments of where you are in terms of your beliefs, your way of life, etc. And again, that's what makes this so difficult. Typically, the vast majority of us think of culture in terms of our visible differences between one community and another. But the majority of our culture actually lies in that hidden or unseen aspect. So it's all the information about us that lays underneath the water. And that is what we call deep culture. For me, culture is both performed and possessed. So for instance, surface culture, which are the things that you see. So that includes things like my clothes, the language that I'm speaking, my food, my flag, my friends. Those are surface culture. These are things that I perform. These are things that you can visibly see and identify about me. At the same time, my deep culture is something that I possess. So these are my beliefs, my values, my norms. It's my gut instinct. If you've ever traveled to a different city, a different state, or country and wondered, why do I feel unsettled? Or why don't I feel like I'm really settling into this space? And it's possible that there are parts of a deeper hidden culture that you weren't able to really identify, but that you were sensing was different from your deep culture, but it's something that you may not have actively reflected on before. So for instance, when I go into a new space, when I go anywhere, whether it's inside Texas or outside of it, I like to see how people stand in lines, whether it's at the grocery store, at the bank, just out on the street. Are they standing close to one another? Are they talking to one another? Do they let elders who are standing behind them go in front of them? Are they standing silently on their phones? When you go to a culture that has a different norm for standing in lines or in terms of standing in close proximity, that's when you realize that something as simple as standing in a line is actually informed by your culture, but it's not something that we consider actively as part of the iceberg. One of the reasons that I actually like to look at how people stand in lines is because it's something that I can easily notice, but it hints at processes and ways of life that are deeper than just standing in a line. It also helps me understand myself. If I'm looking at how people are standing in a line and I'm thinking, that doesn't look right, or that's weird, I have the opportunity then to take a moment and be like, well, why do I think it's weird? If they're just people standing in line, if the work is going to get done, why does it matter? It's much harder for us to recognize our own culture because we're consistently immersed in it. I've shared this example in other presentations, and it's something that I would like to share again. So it's a travel phrase. So there's a very famous travel phrase which says, like a fish out of water. And they use it to describe how they felt when they were in a new or a different space. And while we aren't fish, we immediately will understand what they mean by that metaphor or by that example. We understand that a fish in water will feel differently than a fish that's in air. And even though both substances are clear, they're largely made up of the same things. They look the same. They don't feel the same. And culture is kind of like that. We don't always see it, but it gives us life and it makes us unique. There's no good or bad culture. They're just different cultures. I think the first thing that we really need to accept is that there's no culture that's better than one or another. Just like a person, all cultures have good and bad elements. And so cultures are just different. And so while that makes this even more complicated, I think that there is a little bit of clarity in that confusion of why we sometimes feel uncomfortable having conversations on culture, because it is so complex, because we are so actively involved in it, but that we don't necessarily see where we are and where the culture is always. So how do we as adults then factor into this? One of the reasons that culture is so central to us as humans is that it is a core part of our identity. But our identity also informs our culture. We can actively make decisions to shift our culture. One of the easiest ways to see this is, for instance, changes in fashion. When youth make a decision to dress differently, or walk differently, or speak differently, we automatically are able to identify those trends and say, that's something different. Eventually, those identity changes become active parts of the culture. But that's also what makes this a little challenging. A challenge to our culture can sometimes feel like a challenge to our personal identity. If we want to have conversations on things like cultural humility, cultural responsiveness, etc., it's important for us to recognize that parts of our identity do play into our hidden culture. But none of these conversations that we're having are meant for us to feel bad about who we are or the cultures we come from. It is more for us to understand where is our hidden culture, what is our identity, and how do we actively participate in these things. So the University of Michigan actually developed something called the Social Identity Wheel. And this is to help adults start a reflection process on different parts of their identity. Around the wheel, you'll see that there are different social identities that are written. So these include things like ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, sex, sexual orientation, national origin, first language, physical, emotional, developmental, or ability, age, religious or spiritual affiliation, and race. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just meant to be a handout or a wheel to help get the conversation started. I think it's ironic that I am using the wheel, considering that we are all adult educators and education is actually missing from this wheel. So I do want to make that call out. I do recognize that it is missing from this. These are all elements of our social identity that come into play every single day, whether we realize it or not. And I think that there are some aspects of the identity wheel that we are almost consistently thinking of. But what's more interesting is that there are some aspects of our social identity wheel that many of us don't think of. And we'll each have different parts of the wheel. So, for instance, how often do you factor in age as part of your identity? If you do or if you don't, if it's something that you consistently think of, or if it's something that you never think of, what does that say about your culture in terms of how important age is? As an example, I'm in my early 30s. In the US, particularly in professional spaces, I'm considered very young at the start of my early career. In my home culture in Pakistan, I'm considered an adult. I am firmly at the top of the responsibility list. If a crisis happens and I have to look for an adult, I am the adult. I have to fix it. The reason something like the identity wheel is interesting is that it gives us a starting point to think about different aspects of our social identity. But at the same time, it also gives us a starting point to think about the social identities of the individuals that we interact with. Because if we want to be able to respond to a diversity of thoughts in our classrooms in an inclusive manner, we need to understand not just what makes up their identities as our learners, but also our own identities. I'd like you to think about the list of identities that was on the previous page. What is one aspect of your social identity that you think of the least? So for me, from the social identity wheel, I very rarely think about my ability status. I'm not physically or cognitively or emotionally disabled in any way. I don't need accommodations. It's not something that I think about. And so my social identity of being able-bodied is not something that is frankly on my radar. I think that not thinking about something is as important as only thinking about different aspects of our identity. We tend to focus on areas where we think we have a deficit, or the exact opposite, where we think our strengths lie specifically. I think that it's also important for us to sometimes reflect on, well, what do we forget about? What is just not on our radar? The thing is that if it's not on our radar, that means we're not really actively thinking about it, which means if I'm not actively thinking about it, I'm not always aware of it. I'm not always responding to it. And I might not always think about it in a space where I have learners who it matters to. A fun fact for, I guess, folks in the room that are wondering. So age is actually considered now from two different perspectives. There's your biological age. So your age that's marked by your birthday, but also your age as in the social identity that you have. So for instance, I lost my father at a very young age. I wasn't even a teenager at the time, but I had to all of a sudden have to take on adult responsibilities of helping out around the house. And so while my biological age wasn't old, my social behavior age was mature when it comes to things that get left behind or things that get ignored. You'll see that there's no one consistent factor that gets ignored. We all, and I don't mean ignore in like an active, like I don't want to think about it, but as a human, there are only so many thoughts I can have in a day. We have to let go of some things. And sometimes some of the things that we let go of are all different from one another. And that's okay. We're human. When it comes to our culture, our identity, our social identities, aspects of our identity that we hold very close to ourselves and are almost consistently thinking of versus aspects of our identity that until someone asks, I'm not going to think about it. All of this falls into why cultural awareness, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility are not just important, but why it's important to have these conversations and why these conversations are a little tricky. We're going to do another reflection. I would like you to think about the last time you visited a museum. When was it? Can you remember the museum's name? And do you remember why you went there? This brings us to our first C, cultural awareness. So at its core, cultural awareness means that you understand and accept that cultural differences exist. So recognizing and respecting that differences between oneself and people from other communities or backgrounds exist. And these differences can arise from any part of that identity wheel that we spoke about or the culture iceberg. And that can include anything from your attitudes, your values, your food, to your way of life. It can also come from aspects of your identity that you, again, never really thought about. So for instance, for me, I'm the youngest sibling in my household. I do not think about this, but I also at the same time accept that the experiences of people who are eldest and middle siblings, their experiences also exist and are actually remarkably different than my experiences as the youngest child. I also respect that my life as the youngest in my house was very different from my older sister's life in the same house with the same parents in the same community, same country, and same national background. So even with all those similarities, I know that I had a cultural awareness that just by birth order, I was experiencing life in a very different way than my older sister. So if you have siblings, whether you are older, younger, in the middle, or if you're an only child, that may resonate with you. You may sometimes, in an argument with a sibling, say, you know what? You don't know how good you have it. Mom and dad were not like this, or grandma was not like this, or aunt and uncle were not like this. And that's okay. But cultural awareness is the recognition and respect that differences exist, and differences do not have to stem from social identity markers that are obvious. So for instance, an obvious social identity marker where differences can arise is something like your socioeconomic status. It is obvious that the more money you have, you will be able to move through life in a very different way than for someone who is struggling to make ends meet on a daily or a monthly basis. So cultural awareness is a recognition and respect of those differences. Let's take this then back to our classrooms. Just through this initial foray, we know that there are some identity markers that exist in our classrooms, which we may forget, but they matter. In Texas alone, according to the Teams 2024 data, we have over 65,000 adult learners accessing our grant-funded programs. One aspect of their social identity is race/national origin/ethnicity. And just from that data, we can see that our learners are predominantly from Hispanic or Latino backgrounds. Right now, this graphic isn't even factoring other aspects of identity into consideration. So all we know is that there are over 70% of individuals are from Hispanic or Latino backgrounds. We have no additional information in this graphic on their disability status, their age, their first language, their socioeconomic status, their gender, and so forth. And this is just the first intersection. Just from this graphic, we know that this is an intersection of our adult learners' identities that matters. We have to be aware of the individuals in our room and also across our rooms. So it doesn't just matter that I know who my adult learners are in my classroom. I also need to have a better awareness of, well, who's actually accessing these programs across Texas? Why is it predominantly individuals from certain ability groups, certain age groups, certain ethnicity groups? And that intersection allows me then to become a more responsive individual. So when we start factoring these things into our practice, into our knowledge, into our awareness, we know that differences in our classrooms exist. And these differences don't just exist between our learners and ourselves, but also across our learners. For your adult learners, what is an identity marker that's easy to forget about them? So for me, I often forget about my learner's age. I'm so focused on the language piece as someone that works in the ESL space that I often forget about age. And age, I think, is a very important cultural marker. Where you were in time in history actually dictates a lot about how you act, the way you move, your way of life, etc. Religious or spiritual affiliation, digital literacy skills, their background, their expertise, coming from their home country and having to now start from scratch because of the context that they find themselves in, forgetting their sex, absolutely. And I think what's interesting is that, again, there's not one single thing we forget about our adult learners consistently. We're not all forgetting religious or spiritual affiliation. We're not all forgetting digital literacy skills. We're not all forgetting socioeconomic status. It is the individual experiences that we have in our classrooms with our learners. I think in many ways echoes the things that we also forget about ourselves. We don't all forget the same thing about ourselves. We don't all forget our ability status. We don't all forget our religion. There are different parts of our identities that we forget about ourselves. And in turn, there are different parts of our identities that we forget about our adult learners. It's a very important call out. It sometimes feels uncomfortable to acknowledge that, okay, there are things that I forget about myself. There are also things I forget about my learners. But again, we're humans. I do not believe in perfectionism. I think the goal for being perfect is an unattainable goal. I think it causes more damage than it does good. Acknowledging and understanding where your blind spot is more important than thinking there is no blind spot. And so, how do we build our cultural awareness? It's difficult to stay aware about something that we're forgetting. How do we build it? Well, the very first thing is you have to acknowledge that there are things that we absolutely forget about our learners. Having things like the culture iceberg or the social identity wheel helps us look at an item and respond and say, oh, okay, you know what? These are the things that I think I may be leaving out when I think about my adult learners, instead of just thinking about it on your own or by yourself. When it comes to building your cultural awareness, it's like bridging any gap. You have to learn about yourself first. So we did a little bit of that reflection through the social identity wheel exercise. And then you have to learn about your learners also. We have started to do that just by that reflection of what are some things about our learners that we think we're forgetting. And then you have to make an effort to place yourself in the center of that knowledge building, learning about yourself and learning about your learners. And so what can that look like? As I said earlier in the presentation, I don't immediately start listing teaching tools and tricks. I don't think quick fix tools are the answer to something like cultural awareness, cultural humility, and cultural responsiveness. For something like cultural awareness, I think that there's actually something simpler to start off with, and that is start inwards and then work outwards. And so I come back to our icebreaker question. When was the last time you went to the museum? Some folks said they went yesterday. Some folks said that it's been maybe almost 20 years since they went. And the thing with cultural awareness is that it is built on a foundation of curiosity. So if you want to build your cultural awareness, you need to maintain your curiosity. You don't always have to go to a museum to do that. There are other ways to learn about other cultures. So for instance, you can lean into books, documentaries, music, museums, exhibits, podcasts, and more. But awareness building is an individual activity. You have to take the time to take in these things before you can start asking questions, before you can start responding. To be aware of other cultures, you need to be interested to learn about them, to be curious, and then to also take the time to learn. You do not have to spend hours a day to do this. But if you recognize that your adult learners have social identity markers that are different from yours, they have social identity markers that you are recognizing that you consistently forget. It is the intersection of that individual and that identity marker that you need to take a little bit of time to research and look into. You really only need maybe 10 to 15 minutes a day. You can do this on your way to work. You can do this in your downtime before you take a dinner break or a lunch break, etc., depending on what your work schedule looks like. Even doing something incrementally for 10 or 15 minutes a day will improve your awareness of the identities that sit in your classroom, particularly along the identity markers or the identity wheel spaces that you are recognizing that you consistently forget about. And so then this brings us to our second C, which is cultural responsiveness. So cultural responsiveness means that you are building your understanding and appropriately including different aspects of an individual's identity within an interaction. I find cultural responsiveness to be more clear through examples. Again, coming back to that disability, ability, social identity portion. As for example, I do not have osteoarthritis in my knees. My mother has advanced degeneration in both knees and cannot climb stairs. My mother also loves me and wants to spend time with me. Should I take my mom on a 5-mile hike as a parent-child bonding experience? The internet says it's a good Mother's Day idea. Now, if you're looking at your laptop and you're screaming, no, don't do that to your mom, you're correct. Our bodies are a large part of our culture. If you cannot physically access or enter a space, public or private, but mostly public, you aren't factored into that cultural process. From an awareness perspective, I know about my mom's needs and her knees and how they make her different. But if I take my mom on a hike, I am not being responsive to that need. And the reverse is also true. You can't be responsive without being culturally aware. But just being aware also doesn't butter any bread. For cultural responsiveness, you have to observe and then respond. So how can we become more culturally responsive for our adult learners? First, we have to build our cultural awareness, that first C. This process is not a relay race where you do one loop and then you move on to the next level and you never kind of look back onto awareness again. It's more of a consistent advancement. And that's why conversations on culture, cultural humility, cultural responsiveness are challenging endeavors, because it is, in my opinion, one of the ultimate acts of lifelong learning. It's one of the reasons that people get annoyed and give up, because you don't see an end in sight. Instead of something that has an end goal, if you see it instead as a way to continuously build relationships, you understand that, well, this is something that shouldn't end, because I do always want to build relationships. The second intrinsic part of cultural responsiveness is that once you build a large part of your awareness about the individuals in your audience, in this case, our adult learners, you have to now build your effective and empathetic communication. So ask adult learners in the classroom about what their preferences are. Use empathetic questions and actively listen to their responses. If you feel like you're asking your adults what they want to do, but they're not sharing a preference or they're not giving an opinion, instead start off with giving them a variety of choices, saying you can either do A or B, or you can do A, B, or C, and then let them control that choice. Eventually, as your relationship with them builds, you move from choice and control to actively asking their preferences and then getting that feedback from them. Instead of as an individual activity, responsiveness is an interactive activity. It is something that once you are using that foundation of awareness, you're now using that new information to build an open communication line with your adult learners. Let's go back to that very first icebreaker where we recalled a time where we were a patient and we were in a room with a doctor who wasn't listening to us or treating us in the way that we felt like we needed to be seen. And we recognized how difficult it was to be the patient in that room. There were comments that were shared where, losing trust with the doctor, feeling confused, feeling angry, feeling disappointed. The majority of us have been the patient in the room. It may not always be a medical room, but we know what it feels like to be on the receiving end. However, I think a more pressing reflection question is, when have we been the doctor in that situation? And you'll notice that I'm not asking whether we have been the doctor. And by we, I am including you and I, because the answer is yes, we have absolutely all been the doctors in this situation. We're humans who make mistakes. We need to unlearn this idea of perfection. We've been the patients, we've been the doctors. And in fact, I would argue that because we know how it feels to be the patient, and we've reflected on how crummy those feelings are, it actually becomes even more imperative that we become better doctors in that situation. How can we do that? So for this, we'll move on to the third C, and that is cultural humility. So cultural humility is a personal, lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, whereby we not only learn about someone else's culture, but we start with an examination of ourselves and our identities. This involves a recognition of dynamics and imbalances, a desire to fix those imbalances, and a hope to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. This presentation is actually structured using a cultural humility model overall. We have done self-reflection and self-evaluation. We have done a very brief examination of our learners. We have thought of what that gap looks like between ourselves and our learners. We've thought about how we can respond to that gap using cultural awareness and cultural responsiveness. To further this example, for me, I tend to forget about physical and cognitive disabilities because I do not have physical and cognitive disabilities. It's not central to my identity. I am, however, now placing myself in learning and unlearning spaces to bridge that gap in my work. I am partnering with individuals who have that expertise because I have recognized that I need to fix that, or I need to bridge that gap for myself. And it's not easy. Cultural humility is probably the most complex of these three things, but it's worth it and it's absolutely necessary. The reason it's necessary is because cultural humility is actually what recognizes that I am the expert on my identity. So when you look at me or when you hear different parts of my identity, you may make a subconscious decision about me, but your decision about me will not overshadow my own expertise about myself. So for instance, I'm a woman working in education. And people may think that that makes me very nurturing, that I might have very mother-like tendencies. But as the expert on my identity, I can confirm that there's nothing nurturing about me. It's important to recognize that we'll almost always make decisions about each other based on different parts of our identity, whether we realize it or not. And often those decisions are made for us at a social level, and it's transmitted to us via our culture. So again, in that circle that I shared early in the beginning, we start off with our identity and we circle into culture, and it feeds right back into us. For instance, in a culture that I come from, if someone is an elder, I have to respect them. They can categorically be a terrible person by every standard out there. But if they're older than me, I have to respect them. That is just a knee-jerk reaction based on my culture. Keeping this in mind, then, how can we build our cultural humility? The first is Keep working on your cultural awareness and responsiveness. These processes don't end, they just change. The second is keep engaging your adult learners. You have given them choice and control, now get their views. You've built a line of empathetic communication with them, and you have built that trust. When the doctor doesn't listen, you lose trust in them. But when you actively participate in processes like cultural humility and cultural awareness, cultural responsiveness, it is a trust building exercise. And so your learners are much more likely then to engage with you in two-way dialogue because of that. I would argue, and literature also argues, that the core way to build cultural humility is through continuous self-reflection. You've engaged your learning materials during the awareness activities. You've engaged your learners during the responsiveness activities. In cultural humility, you engage yourself. So let's take a look at what some of those reflection questions could look like. This is an example or a sample set of cultural humility self-reflection questions. So after an interaction with your adult learners, you could ask yourself, what assumptions did you make during this interaction with them? What was a good question you asked your learners? How can you better understand your learners for next time? What made you uncomfortable during this interaction and why? What are you curious about after this interaction? I find cultural humility to be a combination of very interesting and very difficult, because I will have to ask myself some tough questions. For instance, coming back to the example of watching people stand in a line. If I make a judgment to say they're not standing in a line the correct way, I have to ask myself, well, what is the correct way to stand in a line? So I'd like to share a couple of closing thoughts. I said this before in the beginning, I said it in the middle. I'm going to close up with this also because I think it's very important. There is no quick fix path to achieve cultural awareness, cultural responsiveness, or cultural humility. These are processes that will actively change aspects of your identity and yourself. It is challenging, but it is worth it. Who I was at the start of my doctoral studies 2 years ago is remarkably different than who I am now. And that was just in 2 years of me with books. What's important about these processes is that it's not a ladder where you build from one process to the next, meaning you can ignore the other processes once you reach that next level. Instead, I would like you to think about these elements as cogs in a machine. Each one is necessary and important. Each process functions independently, but also impacts how smoothly the others will run. But most importantly, if you stop working on one process or one aspect, the machine will stop. And so in closing, instead of being a fish out of the water, be a seal. I would like you to self-reflect, engage with yourself and your adult learners, actively listen, and maintain a lifelong commitment to curiosity. I think that when it comes to conversations around culture, cultural humility, responsiveness, as adults, we tend to forget about ourselves. We think about it as something that has to happen outside of us, that we have to produce and push to our learners. We are actively as important in that relationship, and that change will also impact us. Being a seal is more important than being a fish. If you are interested in diving deeper into this, the next slide will have references that I've used in the presentation. Thank you for your active participation, your deep self-reflection, and your commitment to honesty and lifelong learning.
We hope you enjoyed this pre-recorded webinar. After you have passed the final test with a score of 80% or greater and have received your certificate of completion, please take a few moments to complete the course evaluation. Participant feedback helps Train PD at TCAL continue to provide high-quality professional development. To leave a course feedback, please go to the completed portion of your transcript. To do this, hover over the My Learning tab and select View Your Transcript. Click on the drop-down arrow next to the word Active and select Completed. Then, click Evaluate in the drop-down menu next to the course you just completed. Please note that your feedback is greatly appreciated.